Back in 2008, when I was doing my junior college year at Sunway University, I had a Malay Muslim friend named Syed. Now, Syed is not his real name, obviously, and I can't use his real name because that would be a breach of privacy. I say he was my friend because he's no longer my friend, and the reason for that is because of a remark he once made in a casual conversation we were once having, to which he replied to me on something I said about Hitler, that Hitler did many things wrong, he said, but one thing he didn't do wrong was getting rid of the Jews. In fact, Hitler did not do enough to eradicate the world of Jews. And to me that seemed like a very shocking thing to say, because Syed seemed to me until then to be a very open-minded, tolerant and respectful person who had friends from all races and religions, right? What could have possessed Syed, a normally nice, reasonable young man, into hating Jewish people? And at the time, being a politically illiterate 18-year-old, I didn't think too much about it, and I simply cast him off. I basically ended my friendship with him because I could not in good conscience be friends with a Nazi, right? But had I been friends with him as an older man, and had I got to know him after becoming more politically literate about the situation in the Middle East, I might have asked him why he didn't like Jewish people. You see, Syed, like many Malay Muslims in this country, are basically not inherently hateful people. In all other respects, they are kind, generous, courteous, and hospitable. But they have been deluded into believing that they hate Jewish people, even if in the depths of their hearts, what they actually hate is not Jewish people, but the false impression they have of Jewish people. This is what some Marxists term false consciousness, which needs to be distinguished from simply raw, hateful bigotry. False consciousness occurs when people who are not politically informed believe in a certain delusion, just because they themselves do not know any better, right? And unfortunately, many people in this country, through no fault of their own, are living in a state of false consciousness. Western commentators often attribute anti-Semitism in the Malaysian region to Prime Minister Mahathir Mohamad, who is by all accounts a nasty man and a virulent anti-Semite. Prime Minister Mahathir has made several denigrating, racially incendiary comments on Jewish people, not Zionists, Jewish people, such as hooked nose. And he has also blamed the Jewish people for much of the world's problems. Unfortunately, these same Western commentators who attribute most of Malaysia's anti-Semitism to Mahathir also seem to be laboring under the delusion that anti-Semitism in Malaysia came out of a vacuum, that Malay Muslims are simply too close-minded, ignorant, and bigoted in order to ever accept Jewish people, and that any hatred for Israel or any refusal to acknowledge the sovereignty of Israel must somehow be anti-Semitic, according to these Western commentators. Yet these Western commentators, who largely serve bourgeois capitalistic interests as well as imperialist European interests, they don't factor in the fact that Mahathir has no problem shaking George Soros's hand, and Mahathir has no problem doing business with Jewish people, and he certainly has no problem doing business with Israeli companies as well. For you see, as I mentioned in my previous video, reactionaries do not actually see race, culture, and religion. They want us, the people of the world, to see race, culture, and religion, so that we cannot unite ourselves on the common uniting factor, which is class. But they themselves unite on the basis of their own class interests. In that regard, Mahathir is no more anti-Semitic than any other reactionary in Malaysia, who basically plays race and religion in order to galvanize the feelings of the people. These race baiters basically point to an entire group of people, the Jews, and say that Israel, the actions of Israel against the innocent Palestinians in Gaza and the occupied territories really reflects the actions of the world Jewish community, which is in fact something that Benyamin Netanyahu, the Prime Minister of Israel, cannot disagree with, right? Since Benyamin Netanyahu himself professes to speak on behalf of all Jewish people around the world. And by pointing fingers at the Jewish people, not the Zionists, the Jewish people as the big boogeymen of the world, these reactionaries can distract the masses away from themselves, who are picking the people's pockets. By purposely blurring the line between Jewish person and Zionist, these reactionaries galvanize the Malay Muslim masses into hating an entire group of people, while they themselves distract the people from the rapacious thieving actions of the capitalist class, when the people are basically united not on class, but on race and religion. And that is how they have duped millions of Muslim people around the world, as well as in Malaysia, who would otherwise be amicable to Jewish people, into hating Jewish people by conflating the actions of the European state of Israel with all Jewish people. And Benyamin Netanyahu cannot argue on the point that Israel is representative of all Jewish people, because that too is a line that he has used on more than one occasion, claiming to speak on behalf of all world Jewry, including Jewish people who despise the state of Israel and everything it stands for. Even they too shall be called anti-Semitic someday, or perhaps they shall be called people with internalized anti-Semitism. Malaysian liberals disingenuously ask this question: why do Malay Muslims hate Jewish people so much, even though the more educated Malay Muslims have clearly made a distinction between Zionism and Judaism, and the more informed Malay Muslims are open to hearing Jewish points of view? Malaysian liberals still parrot the Western colonial talking points that decry Malay Muslims as simply being close-minded and backward, without analyzing the material conditions which led to them being such in the first place, right? As you are aware, human beings are social creatures. They are a product of their social circumstances, right? These liberals, these pro-West liberals, will basically call their fellow Malaysians backward and anti-Semitic without considering the material conditions that drove them to be anti-Semitic in the first place, right? And what's worse is that while they criticize condemnation of Israel as anti-Semitism, despite the fact that there are many Jewish people who also condemn Israel, these liberals themselves basically flaunt their privilege over other Malaysian people by saying things like, oh, the average Malay Muslim has never met a Jewish person, yet they hate Jews so much. Well, that's because, you see, people in a cloistered, suburban, liberal elite bubble do not realize that travel is a privilege and a luxury that's not afforded to the vast majority of people in this developing country of ours. And yet, these very same people who live in ivory towers have the audacity to lecture and moralize to the working class of this country to fix their attitude and stop being so anti-Semitic without trying to get down to their point of view in the first place and trying to understand where their dislike for Jewish people comes from. It never occurs to these liberals that Malay Muslims are not inherently hateful people, they are not inherently intolerant people, and that their hatred for Jewish people, if it exists, is merely a product of false consciousness, installed by years and years of brainwashing by the right-wing reactionaries in their madrasas, as well as right-wing reactionary politicians who basically conflate Zionism with Judaism, who at the same time have no problem doing business with Jewish people and have absolutely no problem sharing a meal with a Jewish member of the bourgeoisie in private, not in public, but in private. Yes, these liberals are just as myopic when it comes to the conditions of the Palestinians, in saying that Palestinians must learn not to hate, without rewinding the clock back to 1948 in order to understand the source of some Palestinians' hatred, right? The Nakba of 1948 was a catastrophic event that caused the displacement, the violent displacement of nearly 1 million innocent Palestinian people. And while it did indeed create a beautiful dream for some people, it became a nightmare for many, right? But no, Malaysian liberals, to Malaysian liberals, history, you see, only begins when innocent Israeli people die. Then they start to wonder why the Palestinians are being so violent and hateful and anti-Semitic and unhinged. But they never want to rewind the clock back to the root cause of the problem, the Nakba of 1948. Another source of anger for many people in this world is that you could be a chap in Brooklyn who has some Jewish ancestry and who speaks Hebrew, who's never ever been to the Middle East before, but you can get citizenship in Jerusalem within a few weeks, right? You could move to Jerusalem tomorrow, theoretically, if you wanted to. Yet a Palestinian refugee who's been languishing in a refugee camp since 1948, well, such a person cannot return back to his or her literal homeland, despite the fact that he or she may hold the key to his or her old house, quite literally. Because such a person is apparently a security threat. A frail elderly person is apparently a security threat to Israel, right? There are legitimate grievances that these liberals refuse to acknowledge that make people angry towards the state of Israel for the profound injustice it has enacted upon the Palestinians. And they cannot come to terms with the fact that it's not just bigoted Islamic conservatives who hate Jews that is the reason for people's anger towards Israel. These white-collar elite liberals usually have such comfortable lives that, empathizing with another person and trying to see their point of view is something alien to them. They're simply allergic to this idea of trying to empathize with a person who might be angry at the state of Israel for the injustices it has enacted on the Palestinians for over 70 years, simply because they find Israel more relatable, because Israel is a liberal Western democracy. Questionably so, and while they view Palestinians as being backward, conservative Muslim savages, even though there are millions of Palestinians who are not even Muslim. That is how liberals unfortunately view this conflict. They view the conflict as a conflict of the civilized and proper Western world, that is to say Israel, versus the regressive and barbaric Islamic world. And they bring in their culture war into this situation, and because they don't like Muslim Malay reactionaries, they too basically turn a deaf ear to the Palestinians' cries. That is not to say that anti-Semitism does not exist and that anti-Semitism is something which should not be taken seriously, because it should. And the Jewish people, through no fault of their own, have been one of the most marginalized and persecuted groups of people throughout human history, right? European countries in particular have been extremely vitriolic in their persecution of Jewish people. The Jewish diaspora, throughout the Middle Ages as well as the early modern ages, even all the way to the 19th and 20th centuries, were the most persecuted group of people in Europe. And the Jewish people, wherever they went, incurred the hatred of others for being different. And while people may think that Hitler was the worst anti-Semite due to the sheer number of Jewish people that he killed, the fact of the matter is that, in principle, Hitler was not the worst, because Hitler merely had state power. The state power in order to carry out the mass murder of Jewish people on that scale. But I can assure you that many other European leaders in history would have also done the same thing if they had anywhere close to Hitler's institutionalized power. Nobody is denying that anti-Semitism is one of the most vicious forms of bigotry in this world, right? But the fact of the matter is that there's a very, very clear difference between a misguided young Malay person who conflates Zionism with Judaism and has been led to hate Jews because that person misguidedly believes or is misguided into thinking that Jewish people are cruel, and that because of what goes on in Palestine, and a Nazi, an anti-Semitic Nazi who believes that they are inherently superior to Jewish people. And this is one difference that Western commentators, as well as their liberal quislings in Malaysia, do not want to make. It is a distinction that they do not want to make by conflating angry, misinformed people in the global South with anti-Semitic Nazi commandos who believe that they are inherently superior to Jewish people. Malay Muslim people do not hate Jewish people if they do. They do not hate Jewish people because they believe they are inherently superior to them, as the Nazis did, but rather the hatred for Jewish people, anti-Semitism in the global South is different from European anti-Semitism because it arises out of a misguided picture of Jewish people as a result of lack of exposure to actual Jewish people and the poisonous rhetoric that is employed by local reactionaries in order to draw attention away from these reactionaries' own incompetence, right? And this might seem like a far-fetched statement if to anyone who's been listening to American evangelical Christian reactionaries or American neocons with Christian reactionary characteristics like Bill Maher or Sam Harris. But the fact of the matter is that Muslim people are not inherently anti-Semitic, contrary to what you might have been led to believe by these Western reactionaries. The fact of the matter is that every Muslim person in the world acknowledges that most of the prophets in Islam were Jewish, with the exception of Ishmael, Job, Lot, and Muhammad. Virtually every single prophet in Islam was a Jewish person, including Prophet Isa, otherwise known as Prophet Jesus. If Muslim people really hated Jews, and it may seem that they do, if you look at the comments of some of these angry, enraged Muslim people from Malaysia who use the word Yahudi, Jew, as an insult. But I digress. It would seem that Islam is an inherently anti-Semitic religion, but the fact of the matter is that most of the prophets of Islam, with the exception of Job, Lot, Ishmael, and Muhammad, were in fact Jewish. So to spit on Jewish people would be to spit on their own prophets, right? In actual fact, in the depths of their heart, every Muslim in this country acknowledges that most of their prophets were Jewish. And in the depths of their heart, every Muslim in this country does not really hate Jewish people, even though they have been deceived into hating Jewish people, right? Some of them. Because the fact of the matter is that Israel is not doing a very good job at preventing anti-Semitism. In fact, it is exacerbating anti-Semitism. Because when Israel constantly claims to speak on behalf of all Jewish people around the world, and they claim to represent all Jewish people around the world, and Islamic reactionaries in Islamic countries also agree with that, well, is it any wonder why people are led to believe that Israel and Jew equals one and the same, even though you're not actually allowed to form a nation state until the Messiah arrives, right? But as a matter of fact, Jewish people go back a long way in the history of the Malay Peninsula. If the people of Malaysia really hated Jewish people, well, they could have demolished the historical Jewish cemetery in Penang. But the historical Jewish cemetery in Penang is still going strong. And the last person to be buried there died in 2011. 2011, which is our time period, right? if Malaysia really is such an anti-Semitic place, if Malaysians really were extremely anti-Semitic as it was in medieval Europe or Hitler's Germany, do you think that last person to be buried in that Jewish cemetery who died in 1911 would want to be spending his twilight years in Malaysia? David Marshall, the Singaporean chief minister, ran for election and won democratically, right? Many Malay Muslim people also voted for David Marshall, despite the fact that David Marshall was Jewish, and they knew he was Jewish. David Marshall was at the Baling talks with Tunku Abdul Rahman and Tan Cheng Lock. The chief minister, Tunku Abdul Rahman, who would then become Prime Minister of Malaysia, as well as Tan Cheng Lock, were David Marshall's good friends, right? Tunku Abdul Rahman was a Malay Muslim, but he regarded Mr. Marshall with a lot of respect as well, right? In truth, it has not been Muslim countries throughout history that have largely persecuted Jewish people. The worst kinds of Jewish persecution have historically occurred in European Romanized Christian countries, right? When the Nazis asked the king of Morocco to hand over his Jewish subjects, what did the king say? The king of Morocco said, "No, these are my subjects and I will not hand over a single one to you," right? On the other hand, Jewish refugees fleeing persecution in Europe during World War II were turned away by the United States of America. Ironic, isn't it? The United States, which claims to be the biggest defender of Jewish rights, which claims to be the biggest proponent of the Jewish community, turned away Jewish refugees in their hour of need. But do you know who accepted them? Yes, the Chinese accepted them. China accepted Jewish refugees, and despite the fact that the people of Shanghai had barely enough to eat themselves during the Japanese occupation, they tried to share what they had, and it is thanks to the people of China, the generosity of the people of China, not thanks to the American government, that many Jewish people survived the Holocaust, right? That's not to say that there weren't great humanitarian people during the Holocaust, like Sir Nicholas Winton or Oskar Schindler, for example. But by and large, Western governments during the Holocaust were by and large far less active in helping the Jewish persecuted refugees than governments of the so-called Global South, right? After all, it was not the Americans or the British who cornered Hitler in his bunker and defeated him. Guess who it was? Yes, it was Stalin, the communist barbarian who cornered Hitler in his bunker and defeated him. It was not capitalism that defeated Nazism. It was not the Americans that defeated Nazism. It was communism and it was Stalin. But back to the people of Malaysia. You see, the people of Malaysia, many of them may be living in a state of false consciousness, in that they do not really hate Jewish people, and they would not have a problem with a Jewish person from America or Great Britain or any part of the Arabic world. But unfortunately, they have been misguided into believing that Israel is really the universal representative of all Jewish people. and that whatever Israel does is on behalf of the world Jewish community, which is, again, an erroneous delusion. Theodor Herzl, the great founder of Zionism, if you want to call him that, himself said that the anti-Semites will one day become our loyal friends. And if you have been paying attention, you will notice that the most historically anti-Semitic countries, such as the United States of America, Great Britain, and Germany, are now the biggest supporters of Israel. How did their attitude change from going around pogroming and persecuting Jewish people to suddenly becoming the biggest supporters of the so-called Jewish state? Well, the fact of the matter is that Israel, although it may call itself such, is not a Jewish state. And Israel does not speak on behalf of the global Jewish community, right? Israel is a European colonial project meant to serve as a satellite state for the European imperialist ruling class. And it's not just something that I plucked out of my ass as well, yeah? If you read The Jewish State by Theodor Herzl, who was an anglicized Jewish person from Austria, who did not even identify culturally as Middle Eastern, Herzl himself admits just as much. I've already shared this on a few other videos, but take a look.
Palestine is our ever-memorable historic home. The very name of Palestine would attract our people with a force of marvelous potency. If His Majesty the Sultan of Turkey were to give us Palestine, we could in return undertake to regulate the whole finances of Turkey. We should there form a portion of a rampart of Europe against Asia, an outpost of civilization as opposed to barbarism. We should, as a neutral state, remain in contact with all Europe, which would have to guarantee our existence. The sanctuaries of Christendom would be safeguarded by assigning to them an extraterritorial status, such as is well known to the law of nations. We should form a guard of honor about these sanctuaries, answering for the fulfillment of this duty with our existence. This guard of honor would be the great symbol of the solution of the Jewish question after 18 centuries of Jewish suffering.
The reason why Western anti-Semites like Lord Balfour and Winston Churchill support the state of Israel is not because they like Jewish people, but the state of Israel basically serves two purposes in their opinion, right? Three, actually. Number one, Zionism means, theoretically, that the Jewish people, the Jewish diaspora in Europe will be leaving Europe and going back to the Middle East, right? So that would basically wash their hands clean of the Jewish people. So it would basically absolve them of the responsibility of basically addressing anti-Semitism in their own communities, as well as their own personal anti-Semitism. That's the first reason why some of the worst anti-Semites support Zionism. Secondly, the Jewish people, the European Jewish people who go back to the so-called motherland after being away for hundreds of years, are surely to come into conflict with the local populations, right? Because they are culturally so different from the local populations, and they come in, many of them, at least in the 19th century, came in with a colonialist European Western chauvinist mentality, right? Zionism, I must remind you, came about before Nazism, yeah? When Herzl died, Hitler was only 15 years old. So yeah, Zionism has a much older time period than Nazism, right? So it wasn't Nazism that led to Zionism, you see. The second thing that Israel does is to serve as a satellite state in the Middle East, basically serving Western imperialist interests in exchange for its existential survival. Israel could collapse tomorrow if America and the European powers stopped funding it. They stopped supporting it. It would collapse tomorrow. Israel exists not as a Middle Eastern country that lives on normal terms with other Middle Eastern countries, but rather as a puppet, if you will, of the Western colonial powers, basically. And Herzl himself wanted to lead this new state. So Herzl's reason for returning to the motherland was not to protect the Jewish people, but rather to seize political power by himself. It's just that he died before he could actually achieve that goal, right? So by basically serving as a West satellite state and creating destabilization in the region, Israel would also ensure that the Middle East would constantly be a hotbed of conflict, making colonialism a much smoother process for the Western imperialists, right? It's a lot easier to rule over people who are divided, right? And basically, the anti-Semites who support Zionism have no problem with Zionism, despite the fact that Zionism itself is a terribly, terribly bad idea, because for it to succeed, you would have to displace the local population, right? They had to displace Palestinians in order to do that. The anti-Semites have no problem with that, because that would basically shift the blame and remove the resentment. When the local Palestinians start fighting back, then the anti-Semites will say, look at how barbaric these Arab tribes are, you see? So we Europeans have been nice to you after all, right? And the blood debt that the Europeans' powers owe to the Jews will then be shifted to the Palestinians, who will be paying for Hitler's crimes, as well as the crimes of the ancestors of all these European leaders, right? Who would, in a different era, be pogroming the Jews, right? The third thing that Zionism does is for the evangelical Christians of the European countries. They support Zionism because they believe, well, that the Armageddon is going to take place in Israel. And they literally believe that in order to go to heaven, they really need to support Zionism. Not out of any great love for the Jews, by the way, because these evangelical Christians also believe that Jews are subhuman. And when Jesus returns to earth, the Jews will be just as cursed as the non-believers, right? That's the third reason the crazy evangelical Christians support Zionism. But it's not out of any love for the Jews, right? And in fact, I would say that Benyamin Netanyahu's territorial ambitions are not popular with the average Israeli person, right? You saw when Hamas attacked the music festival on the 7th of October. Those young people at the music festival, what did they do? Did they stay and fight Hamas? No. They turned around and ran, as they should have, right? Because this is not their war, right? This is Benjamin Netanyahu's war with Hamas, but it is not their war. These young people would have been soldiers in the IDF at one point, because every Israeli person, if I'm not mistaken, has to do 2 to 3 years of military service, right? So these young people would have been well trained and would have been well equipped to fight Hamas, because settlers are equipped with weapons, right? But what did they do? They turned around and ran because they do value life more than they value Netanyahu's territorial ambitions, right? Benjamin Netanyahu does not care about you. He cares about his territorial ambitions, right? It's not possible he could not have known about Hamas's attack but he simply let them come in. And he let you guys, the people who died, serve as the sacrificial lambs. Why? Because then he could have justification to raze Gaza to the ground, right? He thought he would have justification to raze Gaza to the ground. The people of Israel, the common, ordinary people of Israel are not at fault. They have not oppressed the Palestinians. The common, ordinary people of Israel just want to live normal, happy lives. They don't want to be soldiers. They want to be civilians, right? They don't want to be part of Netanyahu's messianic expansion program. But the problem is, the anti-Semites in the West do not want you to live in peace. In essence, they are still persecuting you, because by supporting a leader that most Israelis hate, by talking as if that leader, Netanyahu, is representative of all the Jewish people in Israel, the fact of the matter is that the American reactionaries and the Western reactionaries have as much contempt for the Jewish people of Israel as they do for people like me, you see. So I just have to reiterate that, Israel is basically located in the global south. And by all other accounts, it should be a global south country, right? And it only exists on the good graces of America. And it is a very parasitic relationship that it has with America, because America can always cut its funding if it doesn't do the bidding of America, right? And if it stops being America's lapdog. If the Israelis were to have a prime minister like Yitzhak Rabin, a reasonable man who wants to give the Palestinians a state, what happens to him? He gets killed, right? Israel, you don't really have a democracy. Because if a socialist leader comes around and says, let us all have a one-state solution, let us put an end to this artificial Zionist creation of Israel, well, that socialist leader would get into the bad books of America, right? And they would find a way to regime change him, right? The fact of the matter is that Zionism, hatred for Zionism is not anti-Semitic any more than is hatred for, colonial Christianity. Because Zionism, unlike Judaism, which is almost 4,000 years old, Zionism is less than 200 years old. Zionism is not Judaism, because Zionism is a 19th century ideology rooted in European colonial characteristics, right? And a distinction must be made between Zionism and Judaism. But I think if that distinction is made, I'm sure most Malaysian Muslims would be quite happy to accept Jewish people, and they would be quite happy to admit that they were misguided in their perception of Jewish people. Unlike many liberals in my country, I'm not a liberal, I'm a left-winger. Unlike many liberals in my country, I have faith in my own people. I have faith that my people will utilize their critical thinking skills and realize, for once, that the problem is not with regular Jewish people who want to live a normal life and basically want to get on with everyone else like the rest of us. The problem is mainly with the Zionists and their anti-Semitic enablers in the Western countries, on whose pleasure the state of Israel survives, right? You may be wondering, what happens then without the state of Israel? What happens if Israel is no more? Well, assuming you have not oppressed the Palestinian people, assuming you're a regular Israeli going about his or her life in a respectable and honorable way, nothing will happen to you. And I have to say this and make it very clear, the problem is not with the Jewish people. The problem is not even with the regular people of Israel, because it is not their fault that they were born in Israel, right? You can't help being born into a global north country. Just like if you're an American, it is not your fault that you're born American, right? But as a principled American, your responsibility or your stance, your support should really be with the people of the world seeking their liberation from the boot heel of colonial authority, right? You are not committing any crime by being a person of the global north. You did not choose to be born in the global north, but you can be our allies in our fight for liberation. And when the people of the global south are liberated, the funny thing is that people in the global north will also be liberated. Karl Marx once said that the white flesh cannot be liberated as long as the black flesh is still branded, referring to the fact that white workers can never truly be liberated until black workers were liberated from the shackles of slavery, right? A liberation of the global south from imperialist domination would mean that the state of Israel would basically be subsumed, collapsed under the weight of its own contradictions. There would be no more state of Israel. But unlike what the fear-mongering reactionaries insist, when we say there's no more Israel, it does not mean that there will be no more Jewish people. The Jewish people who have done nothing wrong, who have lived their lives kindly, respectably, and honorably, will continue to live in the region. In the one state that comes about as a result of the collapse of Israel, Jewish people and Arab people will live together in cooperation and harmony. And I would argue that a two-state solution is inherently racist or is inherently cynical, because it basically assumes the worst characteristics in human beings, and it assumes that Jewish people and Arab people simply cannot get along with each other. But the fact of the matter is that until the Zionists came around in the 19th century, Jewish people and Arab people got along very well, right? In fact, although there were certainly cases of isolated communal violence, the fact of the matter is that Zionism is what has led to this conflict taking place. As I once said, Israeli citizens, normal Israeli citizens, are not interested in Zionism. They're not interested in Benyamin Netanyahu's crazy territorial ambitions for his Israeli empire stretching all the way up to Jordan or Egypt. The normal people of Israel just want to live a normal life and get along with everybody. And I argue that that can only be possible when Israel cuts its fetters from America, cuts the apron strings from the Western power, ceases to be a Western colonial stooge, and from that point on ceases to be Israel. In order for the people of Israel to live, Israel must die. Golda Meir once said, if the Israelis put down their weapons, there would be no more Israel, as if it was such a bad thing. However, a world without Israel also means a world without conflict. For without Israel, there would be no more reason for Hamas to exist. Without military occupation and without the displacement of Palestinian people and the seizing of their homelands, which basically characterizes the genocidal state of Israel, the people of Palestine will have no more reason to be hostile, and peace will be achieved. But it can only be achieved once Israel has been cut off like a bad leg. Right? Because in this new world that we're creating, there can be no room for ethno-states. Israel is an outdated 19th century European concept, and the common people do not want to be a part of it, right? Even if they say they are Israeli citizens. I know that the common people would prefer to live a life of peace. So, when Israel is gone, your life will be peaceful, because there would be no more reason to fight, right? In a country where everyone enjoys equal rights, regardless of whether they are Jewish or Arab, regardless of whether they are Christian, Muslim or Jewish, there will be no more reason for conflict, right? Until then, conflict will continue to happen, even under the two-state solution, because you have basically solved the problem by segregating people from each other. But you have not created true peace by making people embrace each other in a state of harmony. And that state of harmony can only be achieved when Zionism is treated like the cancer it is and is rejected by everyone, including Jewish people inside and out of Israel. Right? And yes, I hope, on my own part, I will continue to educate the Malaysian people. I will continue to cure my compatriots of their false consciousness. And I will teach them that Zionism and Judaism are two completely different things. And on my own part, again, I apologize if my compatriots have made ignorant statements about Jewish people, but I assure you that we are working on rectifying the general public's opinion on Jewish people. And when Israel no longer is a thing, when Israel ceases to be, and there is no more Israel, but one state called Palestine, where Jewish and Arab people live together with equal rights and equal responsibilities, then we can normalize diplomatic relations with this state. And we will be happy to welcome everyone from all races and religions from this state. And we therefore can show the world that it is not against the Jews, it is not against Jewish people, but against Zionism that we stand united. The whole world stands united against Zionism. And the Zionists cannot keep pretending that they represent Jewish people who are perfectly capable of being kind, caring, and compassionate people. Thank you very much and have a good day.